Hi, I'm Annette Dubrouillet, and I'm going to read out loud from a story that was really a favorite of mine when I was a child, and it's called The Secret Garden, and it's written by a woman by the name of Frances Hodgson Burnett. It's actually quite an old book. It was written and first published in 1911, so over 100 years ago. Chapter 1, There is No One Left. When Mary Lennox was sent to Misselthwaite Manor to live with her uncle, everybody said she was the most disagreeable-looking child ever seen. It was true, too. She had a thin face, thin body, thin light hair, and a sour expression. Her hair was yellow, her face was yellow, because she'd been born in India and had always been ill in one way or another. Her father had held a position under the English government and had always been busy and ill himself. And her mother had been a great beauty who cared only to go to parties and amuse herself with gay people. She had not wanted a little girl at all, and when Mary was born, she handed her over to the care of an ayah, who was made to understand that if she wished to please the Memsahib, she must keep the child out of sight as much as possible. So when she was sickly, fretful, ugly little baby, she was kept out of the way, and when she became a sickly, fretful, toddling thing, she was kept out of the way also. She never remembered seeing familiarity, anything but the dark faces of her ayah and other native servants. And as they always obeyed her and gave her her own way in everything, because the Memsahib would be very angry if she was disturbed by crying, by the time she was 6 years old, she was a tyrannical and selfish little pig as ever lived. The English governess who came to teach her to read and write disliked her so much that she gave up her place in 3 months. And when the other governess tried to come to fill it, they always went away in shorter than the first one. So if Mary had not chosen to really want to know how to read books, she would never have learned her letters at all. One frightfully hot morning, when she was about 9 years old, she awakened feeling very cross. And she became crosser still when she saw that the servant who stood beside her was not her ayah. "Why did you come?" she said to the strange woman. I will not let you stay. Send the ayah to me." The woman looked frightened, but only stammered that the ayah could not come. And when Mary threw herself into a passion and beat and kicked, she looked more frightened and repeated that it was not possible for the ayah to come to the Memsahib. There was something mysterious in the air that morning. Nothing was done in its regular order, and several of the native servants seemed to be missing, while those whom Mary saw slunk or hurried about with ashy and scared faces. But nobody would tell her anything, and her ayah did not come. She was actually left alone as the morning went on, and at last she wandered out into the garden and began to play by herself under a tree near the veranda. She pretended she was making a flower bed, and she stuck a big scarlet hibiscus blossom into little heaps of earth, all the time growing more and more angry and muttering to herself the things she would say and the names she would call Said when she returned. "Pig, pig, daughter of pigs," she said, because to call a native a pig is the worst insult of all. She was grinding her teeth and saying this over and over again when she heard her mother come out onto the veranda with someone. She was with a fair young man, and they stood talking together in low, strange voices. Mary knew the fair young man who looked like a boy. She had heard that he was a very young officer who had just come from England. The child stared at him, but she stared most at her mother. She always did this when she had a chance to see her because the Memsahib, Mary used to call her that oftener than anything else, was such a tall, slim, pretty person and wore such lovely clothes. Her hair was like curly silk, and she had a delicate little nose which seemed to be disdaining things, and she had large, laughing eyes. All her clothes were thin and floating, and Mary said that they were full of lace. They looked fuller of lace than ever this morning, but her eyes were not laughing at all. They were large and scared, and lifted imploringly to the fair officer's face. "Is it so very bad? Oh, is it?" Mary heard her say. "Awfully," said the young man in a trembling voice. "Awfully, Mrs. Lennox. You should have gone to the hills 2 weeks ago." The mem-sub wrung her hands. "Oh, I know," she cried. "I only stayed to go to that silly dinner. What a fool I was." At that very moment, a loud wailing broke out from the servants' quarters. That she clutched the young man's arms, and Mary stood shivering from head to toe. The wailing grew wilder and wilder. "What is it? What is it?" Mrs. Lennox grasped. "Someone has died," answered the boy officer. "You did not say it had broken out amongst your servants." "I did not know," the mem-sub cried. "Come with me, come with me." And she turned and ran into the house. After that, appalling things happened, and the mysteriousness of the morning was explained to Mary. The cholera had broken out in its most fatal form, and people were dying like flies. The ayah had been taken ill in the night, and it was because she had just died that the servants had wailed in the huts. Before the next day, 3 other servants were dead, and others had run away in terror. There was panic on every side, and dying people in all the bungalows. During the confusion and bewilderment of the second day, Mary hid herself in the nursery and was forgotten by everyone. Nobody thought of her. Nobody wanted her. And strange things happened of which she knew nothing. Mary alternately cried and slept through the hours. She only knew that people were ill, and she heard mysterious and frightening sounds. Once she crept into the dining room and found it empty, though a partly finished meal was on the table, and the chairs and plates looked as if they had been pushed hastily back when the diners rose suddenly for some reason. The child ate some fruits and some biscuits, and being thirsty, she drank a glass of wine, which stood nearly filled. It was sweet, and she did not know how strong it was. Very soon it made her intensely drowsy, and she went back to her nursery and shut herself in again, frightened by the cries she heard in the huts and by the hurrying sound of feet. The wine made her so sleepy that she could scarcely keep her eyes open, and she lay down on her bed and knew nothing more for a long time. Many things happened during the hours in which she slept so heavily, but she was not disturbed by the wails and the sounds of things being carried out and into the bungalows. When she awakened, she lay and stared at the walls. The house was perfectly still. She had never known it to be so silent before. She heard neither footsteps nor voices, and wondered if everybody got well of the cholera and all the trouble was over. She wondered also who would take care of her now that her ayah was dead. Would there be a new ayah, and perhaps would someone know new stories? Mary had been rather tired of the old ones. She did not cry because her nurse was dead. She was not an affectionate child and had never cared much for anyone. The noise and hurrying about and wailing over the cholera had frightened her, and she had been angry because no one seemed to remember that she was alive. When people had the cholera, it seemed that they remembered nothing but themselves. But everybody had got well again, and surely someone would remember her and come to look for her. But nobody came. And as she lay waiting, the house seemed to grow more and more silent. She heard something rustling on the matting, and when she looked down, she saw a little snake gliding along and watching her with eyes like jewels. She was not frightened because he was a harmless little thing who would not hurt her, and he seemed in a hurry to get out of the room. He slipped under the door as she watched him. "How queer and quiet it is," she said. "It sounds as if there were no one in the bungalow but me and little Snake." Almost the next moment she heard footsteps in the compound and then on the veranda. There were men's footsteps and men entering the bungalow and talking in low voices. No one went to meet or speak to them, and they seemed to open doors and look into rooms. "What desolation," she heard one say. "That pretty, pretty woman. I suppose the child, too. I heard there was a child, though no one ever saw her." Mary was standing in the middle of the nursery when they opened the door a few minutes later. She looked an ugly, cross little thing and was frowning because she was beginning to be hungry and felt disgracefully neglected. The first man who came in was a large officer she had once seen talking to her father. He looked tired and troubled, but when he saw her, he was so startled that he almost jumped back. "Barney!" he cried out. "There is a child here, a child alone, in a place like this. Mercy on us, who is she?" "Is it the child that no one ever saw?" exclaimed the man, turning to his companions. "She has actually been forgotten?" "Why was I forgotten?" said Mary, stamping her foot. "Why does nobody come?" The young man, whose name was Barney, looked at her very sadly. Mary even thought she saw him wink his eye as if to wink tears away. "Poor little kid," he said. "There's nobody left to come." It was in that strange and sudden way that Mary found out that she had neither father nor mother left, that they had died and been carried away in the night, and that the few native servants who had not died had also left the house as quickly as they could get out of it, none of them even remembering there was a Missy Sub. That was why the place was so quiet. It was true. There was no one in the bungalow but herself and the little rustling snake. And that is the end of chapter 1 of The Secret Garden.